Thank you so much for being here today. So today I'll be taking some time to talk about how you can leverage Mabl to create resilient tests, and more specifically focusing on how machine intelligence and human intelligence can be leveraged for reliable testing. So let's start out with some quick introductions. I'll hand it over to my colleague, John.
Hi, folks. I'm John Kinnebrew. I'm a machine learning engineer here at Mabl for the last 3.5 years. And my background is primarily in machine learning and software engineering, working across both academia and industry. And I'm co-presenting today with Juliet.
Thank you. As John mentioned, my name is Juliet MacPhail, and I work at Mabl as a product manager. I've been on the team for about 1.5 years now. I actually started out on our support team and then shortly after transitioned to product management. And my background is primarily in computer engineering and computer science. So we have quite a bit that we'd like to cover over the course of this session. This includes some of the challenges with creating resilient tests, especially in the context of legacy testing tools. We'll also spend some time talking about how Mabl addresses these challenges and enables your team to create tests that are both adaptable and reliable. So in addition to the strategies and techniques that Mabl utilizes to make your testing more intelligent, we will also cover what you can do to help create resilient tests. So that includes the features that allow you to help Mabl learn more about your application and adapt as changes are made to it. We'll also discuss best practices for using these features and for configuring your workspace. So let's talk about resilient testing in the DevOps world. Creating resilient tests has become all the more important as development cycles become shorter and faster. As teams continue to ship more rapidly, testing has become a bottleneck. Maintaining tests becomes a cumbersome task that takes time away from other initiatives. And sometimes tests created using legacy frameworks can be brittle and need to be fixed when an application changes significantly. So when it comes to test maintenance, what options do you have? If you're testing an application manually, you may not need to worry about modifying a test script since humans can easily adapt to these changes. For example, if a button changes from green to blue, that doesn't impact how you test a particular user flow. However, there are still other pitfalls for manually testing, which can be time-consuming, difficult to scale, and does not address the testing bottleneck that I mentioned earlier. So the other option here is automated tests. From scripted tests to intelligent frameworks, maintenance takes a different role based on how you automate your testing. And if you're using a framework that requires scripting, these scripts will need to be updated as the content of your application changes. So when it comes to writing and maintaining tests, there are trade-offs in terms of how and when you invest your time, depending on the framework that you're using. Perhaps you prefer to write carefully curated XPaths and selectors based on attributes that are unlikely to change. And while that's one way to help make your test less brittle, perhaps your team doesn't have time to invest in writing or finding the perfect selector. So when using more brittle selectors, changes in your app may cause these tests to break, which requires time to update the selector and fix the test. So in order to address the problem of creating and maintaining tests, testing frameworks need to have a method of handling dynamic content and adapting when an application changes over time, so you don't have to spend the time and energy making these changes yourself. So here at Mabl, our philosophy on test creation focuses on putting yourself in the user's shoes. You, as the tester, show us what is important and how it works. And Mabl takes on the work of determining what those paths are and capturing all the extra information on the user's flow so we can execute that journey for you. And there are really two key parts to making this work. So the first part is being able to find the correct element, which might seem a little bit obvious at first. So for example, perhaps you create a test where you click the login button on your web page. So how does Mabl find that element again? In a script, you might use an ID or the text, but it's always the same with automated testing tools. So Mabl is automatically capturing this information about all the attributes to ensure we can find this correct element again. The second part here is context. Mabl needs to identify what the landmarks are around an element, and that enables us to ensure we are in the right place when we run through your test. So the next important part here is test execution, and that really ties back to machine learning. As you execute your test over time, Mabl learns more and more about your application. We determine which elements and attributes are stable and what is likely to change. And that gives us a better idea of what we're looking for. Understanding what attributes are most important to an element helps Mabl adapt to these changes. But in reality, these are really hard problems to solve, and it isn't the whole picture. The person creating the test likely knows more about the application than anyone else, and understanding what you are trying to test and why you are testing it is vital. Telling Mabl what your intention behind your test is makes those tests more resilient. But Mabl can't do everything on its own. Sometimes we need human intelligence to fill in the blanks. And we have some new features that'll help with that we'll talk about later on. So as we've discussed before, applications change over time. and some of those changes are small. For example, perhaps you make a simple copy change as shown on this slide. So here you can see a button simply changes from downloads and PDFs to downloads/PDFs. But some of those changes might be large. Perhaps your team decided to rewrite the entire underlying framework of your application. And unlike scripts, Mabl is continually updating what it knows, and it does so for every run of the cloud. If the copy changes, Mabl can adapt. If the CSS changes, Mabl can adapt again. Eventually, a script would break with these changes. Since we are continually rewriting the script, we can build on what we know. And beyond these incremental changes, tests are brittle when you make big changes as well. And Mabl really has the ability to do a good job of guessing how an element may have changed into a new version, and it'll automatically attempt to heal these tests when you have big changes. You might know that as Autoheal. So Mabl will give you information about a substantial change and provide the visibility to ensure that everything is working as expected. When it comes to auto-healing in Mabl, there are a couple of different ways to gain visibility into this learning process. For every cloud run, Mabl is tracking a wide range of attributes for each element it interacts with in your application. And all of that raw data feeds into Mabl's learning and aids its ability to be resilient. A prime example of how Mabl tracks this is the element history. So for each test run, you can view some of the most important attributes that Mabl is tracking. And when something about an element changes, Mabl will highlight those differences in the element history. So for example, here you can see the text changed from downloads and PDFs to downloads/PDFs based on our previous example. And in addition to reviewing the element history, you can also roll back Mabl's knowledge of an element to any previous version. This is especially helpful if you're running a one-off test on a new version of your app, and if the app has been rolled back, you can also roll back this element information. So when it comes to more substantial or radical changes in your application, Mabl has other methods for providing this information. An example of this is Autoheal Insights. When a number of significant identifying attributes for an element have changed, Mabl will make a best guess at finding the updated element, and an insight will be generated that highlights the differences for the element in the auto-healed step. So here we can see that the position, text, href, width, and color all change for this button. So Mabl will give you the visibility into that change and allow you to control it through the element history. You can also review additional information on what Mabl has learned about an element by viewing the logs in the test output. I'm just going to hand it over to John.
Thanks, Juliet. So now that we've heard a little about what Mabl's doing to make your tests resilient, let's talk about what you can do to work with Mabl and really take that to the next level. So a good starting point is how you configure your workspace. One of the most important parts here are the environments and how they map to your actual environments and servers. Say you have a staging environment and a production environment, as well as some one-off ephemeral development environments. In Mabl, if you've mapped these to those three different environments, Mabl will keep all of the information it's learning about the elements and their history, as well as all the other information going into models feeding other insights like visual changes or timing anomalies. So all of this information will be kept separate so that, say, some change in a dev environment doesn't immediately apply to your production environment, since it may never make it there, and either way, it's not going to be there at the moment. In addition to setting up your environments, the flows in Mabl are a good way to help reuse both of the different steps that you're doing in a particular test across other tests, as well as this element history and the things Mabl's learning about your app. So anything that Mabl learns about a particular component in some reusable flow is going to be applied across all the tests that use that flow. And of course, there are a variety of ways to actually run these tests in Mabl. You can run them in plans based on triggers, or you can run them manually in plans, or you can do an ad hoc run, as well as local executions with the command line or with the trainer. And only some of these different ways of running a test will actually be the ones that Mabl uses to learn about the elements and update that information. In particular, anything run as a plan, whether it's triggered by a deployment or by a timer, or whether you manually trigger a plan run in the web app. These are kind of the gold standard for Mabl. These are the runs that it uses to learn about both the screenshots and visual changes and timing of your test executions, as well as all the information about the elements and components. Any of the other approaches like ad hoc runs or running in the trainer or the command line are more intended for the development cycle to perfect these tests, to edit and debug them, rather than ones that Mabl's going to use that information in subsequent runs. Next slide, please. So let's imagine that we're working with the app on the right, and we're building a flow that goes through this page. We click on this first alpha 1045 option here, then we submit that, and down below, we see results start populating based on that option. There's a lot of stuff that Mabl's capturing, as Juliet talked about, in terms of the attributes of these elements and the context around them. But one thing that Mabl can't capture automatically is more of the intent. What was the user or the creator of this test trying to do in this particular flow? So here, maybe you chose alpha 1045 simply because you needed to select any option, or maybe it's particularly this option that's being tested in this particular flow. So that kind of information about why you picked a particular element, and in this case, say a radio button that also has this label, although that's a different element and they're all associated with each other in the DOM in different ways, information about why you picked that is very helpful to make sure Mabl picks the right thing the next time. Then again, there's things like the submit button. There's only one button on this page. It says submit. It's probably not likely to change a lot in the future. That's not the kind of thing that really Mabl needs any extra help to understand why you chose it. And then of course, there's also these results that start populating based on data from the server. So these may take a little while to populate. It may take some time, and they may pop in one after another, like the little spinner at the bottom would indicate. And knowing when the particular row that you're interested in, say you want to make an assertion on it, when that's available and when your app's ready in the next state to continue with the test, is another piece of key information that it can help to express to Mabl what your intent was. Next slide, please. So how do you actually express this kind of intent information in Mabl? If you go to a particular step, you can configure the find for the element that's going to be used in that step. And you'll see options like this, where you could choose it based on various attributes like the class here, or information about the container that's actually wrapping around this element and potentially others. So in this option, say we wanted to choose the alpha option, and maybe that 1045 is going to change frequently or every time we see this. So we'd want to say, okay, it's in this container with inner text, but we don't just want the full alpha 1045. We can actually choose edit here and say, I just want it to contain alpha. And that way Mabl knows that it's supposed to choose this option, even if it shows up as the second one or the third one next time. And even if, say, that 1045 is going to be a different number each time. And in general, what we're trying to do here is strike the right balance. So we wouldn't want to go through and select every single option. That would basically tell Mabl every single thing should match every time. And it's going to sit and wait to find the right element based on what you've told it. And that means it's going to wait a long time if any of these tiny things change about the element. So rather, it's trying to strike a balance of what's going to be something that will persist and be stable about the element, like the alpha here, as well as making sure that we don't choose the things that we don't actually care about. So maybe the class names might change in the future, but that's not really important. A counterexample would be something like where the class name determines that this button or this option is green. And maybe that's the key to why you wanted to choose this option. In that case, you'd want to make sure to specify that. And beyond choosing the different attributes and meta attributes and container information to help Mabl pick the right one, the next screen shows a timeout. So it says wait up to 15 seconds for a matching element to appear. So here, the idea is to give Mabl an idea of how long this might take, so that if something has changed about your application and Mabl needs to auto heal, it won't wait forever, but it will wait long enough to be sure that this really is a new change or something really has changed in this test or this app. So here you more or less want to pick the longest time you'd expect under any normal conditions for it to take for this page to update and the option you want to appear. And then you can finally choose whether you want to auto heal or fail this step if, after waiting up to that time, looking for the right element based on the information you've provided, Mabl still can't find it, it can either attempt to auto heal, or you can say, no, it should always be alpha. If it's not alpha, this test shouldn't pass, and tell it to fail the step. And of course, when it's doing this with the weighting, if Mabl finds an element that matches the criteria you've set, it'll go right ahead. It's not going to wait for this timeout every time. It's only going to wait up to that timeout if it's not finding something that matches what it was told it should look for. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have even more challenging scenarios. So, for example, tables and grids may be populated with dynamic data. And this, of course, is going to change regularly as Mabl tries to execute this test. And as you can see on this example on the right, maybe we have an edit button in every single column. So if, say, we select that top edit button, it's not immediately obvious whether we're trying to select the first row's edit button, or maybe the row that has this 10-1 identifying number, or maybe we only cared about a row that had the ready status as opposed to the error status in the second row. So there are lots of different intents we might have for choosing this button, and there are a bunch of similar buttons in there that Mabl might get confused if it doesn't understand why it's supposed to choose a particular one. So when this kind of scenario happens, Mabl adds the provide more context little badge on the step that you can see on the right. And if you click on this, you have two options of either going to the quick edit to give Mabl some information like that configure find information we saw before, or going and reviewing the element selection so that Mabl's sure it's in the right state and can provide you even better feedback on the options you're choosing. Next slide, please. So when you've selected the review element selection and told Mabl, this is the element I want, and I'm in the right place in my app for you to show me what I'm choosing and how it affects Mabl's decisions, you'll get this overlay that shows you all of the similar elements highlighted. And then you have the same kind of options to choose containers and attributes and other information about the element that you expect to be stable and to help identify the right thing. In this case, then Mabl will continually narrow down the options that it sees that match this, so you get some immediate feedback to help be sure that you're picking what you really want. And of course, you don't need to narrow it down to one here. If, say, any of these edit buttons that are in a ready status row are the right ones, then you can say, oh, I want the container that contains ready. And it'll say, okay, here are 3 options, and that's all you need to do. But in addition to being able to just say, I want this attribute, or I want it to contain this, you can also choose some other options here. Like at the bottom, you see its position is first. So maybe it's not so much which row you want, you just want to use the first row or the last row. So you'll have that option if the one you selected is the first or last of these elements. And if you're choosing something that's based on dynamic data, it can be very helpful to use variables as well. So say you created this configuration that's going to show up in this table in an earlier step, and you gave it some unique ID number that was generated, and you save that to a variable, then here you can say, oh, I want the container that contains, and then use the normal variable syntax that you use in Mabl to say whatever the value of that variable is, that's what the row that I want should have that in it. Next slide, please. So wrapping it up, we've talked a lot about what Mabl's doing to battle brittle tests and provide better resiliency, things like the auto healing and adaptation, as well as how you can get more visibility and control in these processes through the insights and the element history. And then we've talked some about how you can really take that resiliency to the next level. Things like setting up the environments and how and when you run plans and tests in your workspace, as well as being able to configure finds and the similar wait until option that has the same kind of options but is a separate step, as well as providing more context when Mabl sees a bunch of similar elements like with a table or a grid.
Thank you, John and Juliet. That was awesome. So what questions does everyone have? Please remember to submit those Q&A, submit your questions in the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. We do have a few questions already, so I'm going to get started, but you can continue to submit them throughout the rest of this session. Okay. First question. When Mabl asks for more context on a step, how should I decide whether to use the edit option, the quick edit option, or review the element selection?
Good question. So the review element selection option is really there to enable Mabl to provide more feedback to you. So that's how you'll get that overlay that shows exactly which elements match, and be able to narrow that down and see in real time which elements Mabl would be looking at as you change the options there. So it's really kind of the preferred choice, but it does involve the extra step of highlighting the option or highlighting the element and telling Mabl, okay, I'm in the right place. I'm on the page that I need to be. Here's the element again that I want to be talking about. The other option, the quick edit, if you've already created the step and you're just making a quick change, you say, oh, I need to specify that it's one of the ones with alpha instead of beta in the text. You know exactly what you're trying to do, what you're going to tell Mabl. So you can just go to the quick edit option. You won't get the overlay, but you can very easily and quickly provide more information.
Cool. Next question. If you don't narrow down the options to a single element, how does that affect reliability and speed?
Very interesting question. So when Mabl's looking for these elements, it's trying to use all that information that it's captured and the things it's learned from repeated executions of your test. So if you've narrowed it down to, let's take that example again, where you've got 4 edit buttons. If you said, I want one that's in a ready status row, well, that was 3 of them in that example. It may be 2 or 5 or whatever in a future run. Mabl's going to do that, say, okay, here are the 5 things that look right. And then it's going to use all the additional information that it's been capturing to go ahead and pick the one that looks most like what you trained it on and what it's seen in the past. So as long as you've narrowed it enough to get the right thing, which in this case was any of the edit buttons that are in a ready status row, then it will be just as fast and just as accurate. So you really don't have to worry about narrowing it down any more than kind of captures your intent for the test and for that particular step.
Awesome. Okay, a couple more questions. What is Mabl capturing in a test that helps them identify auto-heal opportunities?
Yes, so Juliet talked a little bit about this, all the different attributes. So many different attributes that the individual element that you selected, like let's take that earlier example with the radio buttons. You clicked on that input. Mabl's going to capture all of the different attributes on that input, things like the ID, things like the text, if there were any. For something like an input, often the text is associated through a label or through other elements nearby with text. So that's one of the other things Mabl captures in that context. It's going to look for a good container that contains that input radio button, but also has additional information that helps narrow it in on the same radio button next time. So things like the label or other text. And then it's also going to capture some more meta attributes, things like how the button is actually rendered. So things like where it is on the page, how big it is, what the bounding box is, as well as more information about kind of the broader context in the application. So it's going to capture things like what the URL was when it was trained, as well as each time that the test is executed. And it's going to capture things like the title of the page. And when it's executing in the cloud in a plan run, it's also going to be capturing a lot more information like a full DOM snapshot, a screenshot. If this is running in Chrome, it's running in it's going to capture a Chrome trace. And all of those are used to provide better models for Mabl in terms of both finding the right element, but also other insights like the visual change insights.
Great. We have one more question. final question, can you configure finds in plans or just specific tests?
Sure. So basically, the configuration is for the particular step. So you're configuring a find for a particular step in a particular flow or test. So if you configure it for, say, a reusable flow, that's going to apply across any test that that flow is in. And if you configure it for a step in a test that's not part of a reusable flow, it's only going to apply to that particular test. So you can get to that a number of different ways. You can go to that by opening up the trainer and getting to the right place in your app and configuring the find, maybe using that review element selection so you get the full feedback. Or you can use the quick edit in the app where you can go to that step again and configure the find. And even in the run output, there's an option to edit that test and configure the finds in it directly.